A scream echoed beneath a swell of music, and not a single soul heard it. In the shadowed world of harmony and deception, something terrible played just out of tune. This is a tale where silence hides a crime, and only the most attentive ear can hear the truth behind the curtain. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on a damp and lingering October evening in the year 1897 that I found myself once again seated opposite my friend Sherlock Holmes, as the rain traced faint calligraphy against the windows of Baker Street. There had been no cases of late, no mysterious footprints, no telegrams in cipher, no clients arriving breathless with terror. Holmes, for his part, had taken to a peculiar form of distraction. Orchestral scores littered the floor, and he had spent the better part of the afternoon humming Schubert under his breath while examining a violin part as though it were a cryptographic code. "You see, Watson," he murmured without lifting his eyes, "there is a logic to music that criminals would do well to emulate, at least the competent ones." I made no reply, for experience had taught me that Holmes' eccentric fascinations were often harbingers of something far more disturbing. Our conversation, or lack thereof, was interrupted by a hesitant knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson admitted a tall gentleman with a pallid complexion and nervous gait. His overcoat was finely tailored, yet dusted with the grime of fog, and he wore gloves which he did not remove. Beneath his velvet collar, his Adam's apple twitched with restraint. "Mr. Holmes," he said in a voice so subdued it barely stirred the air, "I apologize for coming unannounced." Holmes gestured toward the hearth without a word. "I believe I heard a scream," the man continued, "but no one else seems to think it occurred." His eyes, dark-ringed and alert, flicked from Holmes to me and back again, as though measuring whether he had made a mistake in coming at all. The man introduced himself as Mr. Edgar Penrose, conductor of the Royal Philharmonic. He spoke not with pride, but with a weary formality, like a man recently awakened from a dream he did not fully understand. "It happened during the fourth movement," he said. "There was a swell in the violins, and then a scream, distant but unmistakable, like something smothered beneath the strings." "No one else heard it?" Holmes asked quietly. "No one. Not the audience, nor the musicians. I stopped the orchestra. I insisted we pause. They thought I was mad." He hesitated. "But I am not mad, Mr. Holmes. I know what I heard." I watched Holmes closely as he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands like a man about to examine a new kind of fossil. Before the performance, Penrose said, he had discovered something strange among his conductor's score. An unfamiliar page, creased and perfumed faintly with tobacco. It contained no musical notation, only a single line written in a neat foreign hand. "The second violin shall play the final scream." "I thought it a joke," he admitted. "Perhaps a cruel jest by one of the younger players. But now—" He trailed off. Holmes asked to see the note, but Penrose confessed he had burnt it in a fit of anxiety. Only the wording, etched into memory by fear, remained to him, and now to us. For several minutes after the account, Holmes said nothing. He did not smoke. He did not fidget. He simply stared at Penrose as one might study the silhouette of a tree at twilight, seeking shape in shadow. Then, with the faintest shift of his gaze, he said, "And no one is missing, injured, or behaving oddly?" "Not that I know of," Penrose answered. "But something happened, Mr. Holmes. I felt it in the music." At last, Holmes stirred. He reached for his violin, tapped it once with a slender finger, and murmured, "A scream one does not hear is often the most telling." As Penrose departed into the fog, Holmes closed the door with an absent motion and remained still for a moment, nose tilted slightly upward. "Interesting," he murmured. "Tobacconist's ash on the left lapel, Turkish blend, and ink on the fingertips. though the man claims only to conduct, not to write. You think he withholds something? I asked. Holmes turned to me with a faint smile. My dear Watson, he said, if the scream was real, then the silence that followed must be examined with greater care. He plucked a note on his violin, C sharp, low and haunting, and the case, it seemed, had begun. Mr. Edgar Penrose sat forward in his chair, with the quiet intensity of a man unburdening himself after many nights of unrest. His fingers twitched at the edge of his gloves, but he made no move to remove them. I did not mention one detail earlier, he said, eyes lowered to the floor. It seemed absurd at the time, yet now I fear it may not have been absurd at all. Holmes, without comment, gestured for him to continue. 3 nights before the concert, Penrose explained, I was reviewing my conductor's score in solitude. As is my habit, I found a loose page tucked between the andante and the allegro. It bore no staff lines, no musical markings, just a single sentence, elegantly written in ink that had only just dried. He paused, the memory clearly troubling him. There was no signature, no initials, no explanation. Just a line that I cannot forget. Holmes leaned forward slightly. What did it say? Penrose's lips parted reluctantly. The second violin shall play the final scream. He looked at us as one who expected ridicule. He received none. Holmes merely folded his hands. Curious, he murmured. Very curious indeed. It would be dishonest to say that I did not feel a distinct chill at the phrasing, although I made some effort to conceal it. Holmes, however, betrayed nothing. You assumed it a jest? He asked. A poor one, yes, or perhaps a poetic flourish by one of our younger musicians. Holmes nodded slowly, eyes narrowed. And you told no one? Of course not, said Penrose. There is already a certain theatrical sensibility to our world. One doesn't invite further eccentricity by airing such things. And yet, Holmes said dryly, you now sit before me, speaking of screams no one else has heard, and anonymous phrases etched into your memory. Penrose coloured faintly but did not object. There was something in the handwriting, he added softly. It seemed foreign, European. I am no graphologist, but it struck me as unusually refined, not English. Holmes said nothing more at that moment, but his eyes flicked toward the hearth, as if calculating the shape of something we could not yet see. Penrose folded his gloved hands in his lap, and for a moment there was only the sound of the fire shifting in the grate. It was Holmes who broke the silence. Describe the scream. Penrose blinked. I beg your pardon? You say you heard a scream during the performance. I would like you to tell me exactly how and when it occurred. Penrose hesitated, clearly uncertain how to frame it. It came during the 4th movement, as the violins entered their fortissimo. There is a particular surge of sound, 3 bars into the 2nd page, where the strings swell as a single voice. It was at that moment I heard it. A scream, brief but piercing, or rather, it should have been piercing. It was swallowed almost instantly by the crescendo. He paused, like something crushed beneath a wave. I glanced at Holmes, who sat perfectly still. You stopped the orchestra? Yes, I dropped my baton. It was instinctive. I turned, looked to the wings, and saw nothing but the usual clutter of stagehands and cases. No one else reacted? I asked. Not a soul. Penrose pressed a hand to his temple. They stared at me as though I had lost my mind. Holmes remained quiet, but I noticed his fingers twitch ever so slightly against the armrest. His version of a conductor's baton, perhaps. Penrose went on with a haunted expression that seemed only to deepen as he spoke. I resumed the performance. What else could I do? We completed the final movement, and the audience, unaware of anything unusual, applauded with great vigour. He looked up, his voice taking on a strange distance. But as the curtain fell, I did something I have never done before. I left the stage mid-bow and went directly backstage. "Whom did you question?" asked Holmes. "Everyone I could find. The assistant stage manager, the porters, even the violists waiting to pack up their cases. I inquired whether anything odd had occurred, whether anyone had seen someone leave or heard any noise not part of the score." "And?" Penrose shook his head. They looked at me with vague sympathy, some with irritation, but no one knew what I was talking about. He hesitated, or claimed not to. Holmes gave a short nod, more to himself than to us. "So you heard a scream that no one else will admit to, a note from no one, and silence from everyone. We shall have to see whether the silence proves more revealing than the sound." As Penrose spoke, I noticed Holmes watching him with that detached focus, which always suggested his mind was collecting impressions far beyond the spoken word. At last, Holmes rose and retrieved a magnifying lens from his desk drawer. "Forgive me," he said mildly, "but may I examine your gloves?" Penrose blinked. "My gloves? You've not removed them since arriving," Holmes replied. "I suspect the hands beneath them have stories of their own." After a brief hesitation, the conductor removed his right glove and placed it in Holmes' outstretched hand. Holmes examined the fingertips closely. "Stained with ink," he murmured, "and not fresh either. Black ink from a dip pen. And there," he pointed with a delicate gesture, "a faint tremor in the thumb muscle, not congenital, recent, perhaps even stress-induced." Penrose said nothing, but his jaw had tightened. Holmes handed back the glove and sniffed delicately. "And a trace of Turkish latakia on your left sleeve. Yet you don't smoke." "No," Penrose murmured, "but many of our musicians do." Holmes gave a courteous bow of the head, but said no more. Whatever lay beneath Penrose's composed exterior, Holmes had seen more of it than the man had intended. When Penrose departed some minutes later, his coat drawn tightly about him and his eyes wary of the street's shadows, I turned to Holmes, who remained by the fire, his fingers laced and eyes lowered. "You believe him?" I asked. Holmes replied without looking up. "I believe he heard something. The question is whether it came from within the hall or within his conscience." "You think he's unstable?" Holmes looked up with a slight frown. "No. In fact, I think him unusually observant, which is rather different. But he is also frightened, less by the scream than by what it implies." I considered this in silence. Holmes rose, went to his violin case, and removed the instrument. He tuned it softly, one string at a time, and began to play a quiet, wandering phrase that I did not recognize. "Do you think the note was a warning?" I asked. Holmes tilted his head. "Or a confession, or perhaps a dare. We must not assume that the anonymous always wish to remain so." "And the scream?" He lowered the violin. "Someone went to great lengths to make it heard by only one man. I propose we find out why." And with that, the note faded, but the mystery had only just begun. 2 days after Mr. Penrose's visit, Holmes and I made our way to the Royal Philharmonic Hall under the agreeable pretense of musical interest. The conductor had arranged for us to attend a rehearsal of Schumann's Manfred, though Holmes confessed on the cab ride over that he found Schumann needlessly emotional, rather like attempting mathematics through fog. The hall was a magnificent structure, echoing with the half-tuned mutterings of string instruments and the occasional squawk of a restless oboe. We were introduced as friends of Mr. Penrose and shown to a modest box from which Holmes surveyed the stage with casual but precise attention. "You see, Watson," he murmured as the orchestra warmed up, "the theatre has always been a favoured place for deception. Curtains serve both drama and concealment equally well." As the rehearsal began, Holmes' gaze wandered, not over the performers but behind them, to the shadows of the wings, the dim corridor to the dressing rooms, and the figures who lingered too long in passing. "I have always said," he added quietly, that it is the audience we must observe when watching a play. But in this case, Watson, it is the stage itself that may be playing the part. It was during the interval, over weak tea in the conductor's lounge, that Holmes turned to one of the assistant directors, a brisk man named Beechcroft, and inquired with perfect nonchalance after the orchestra's recent departures. "Only one," said Beechcroft, stirring his cup with mechanical vigour. "Mr. Harold Venn, violist, gave notice rather suddenly last week and left for Paris. No forwarding address." "Curious," Holmes replied. "Had he been with the Philharmonic long?" "Oh, 4 years. Quiet sort. Reliable, though not exceptional." "And he departed the day after the concert in question?" "Yes, indeed. Wednesday morning. Left a letter with the treasurer. Seemed in a dreadful hurry." "Did he say why?" Beechcroft shrugged. "Just that he needed a change. Family matters, I think." Holmes gave a slight nod, but I could tell from the glint in his eye that the matter had not settled. As we returned to the box, Holmes whispered, "It is remarkable how often men flee for Paris when they are not quite ready to face London. You think his departure connected to the scream? I think it exceedingly odd that the one man to vanish did so without telling a soul where he could be reached, save a treasurer who happens to control the orchestra's accounts." After the rehearsal, Holmes expressed a desire to examine the backstage area, claiming a professional interest in the acoustic diffusion of orchestral architecture, a phrase which clearly baffled the stage manager but nonetheless granted us access. The passage behind the stage was narrow and cluttered with flight cases, music stands, and the detritus of performance. But Holmes' attention fixed on a particular alcove near the second wing, where a broken wall sconce hung at an odd angle. "Curious," he murmured, running a gloved finger along the edge. "This light, how long has it been out?" The stagehand shrugged. "Since last week, sir. Electrician's been meaning to fix it." "And the exact day?" "Tuesday, after the performance." Holmes crouched, examining the scuffed flooring beneath the sconce. "Then on the night in question, this area would have been dark." "Yes, sir. Pitch dark." I watched as he traced a faint line along the wall with his finger, stopping at what appeared to be a hairline crack. "Watson," he said softly, "picture a scream buried beneath music, heard only by one man, and the nearest shadows hiding everything that followed it." He straightened. "We are dealing with a crime composed in silence and concealed in shadow." As we lingered near the rear exit, Holmes turned his attention to a wiry young porter who had been hovering near the crates, fiddling with a length of rope and carefully not meeting our eyes. "You were working the night of the concert?" Holmes asked pleasantly. The man nodded. "Yes, sir. See anything unusual?" The porter scratched his head. "No, sir. Busy night, that's all. No one come or go unexpectedly. No one linger backstage longer than they ought." The man hesitated. "Not that I saw." Holmes studied him. "And yet your eyes flicked left just now when I said linger, toward the corridor where the dressing rooms lie. Tell me, is that where Mr. Venn's locker was kept?" The man's lips pressed together. "Couldn't say, sir." "Couldn't or wouldn't?" There was a silence. Then the porter said, "If I talk too much, I'll lose this job." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Then allow me to assure you, silence, too, can be a dangerous position." We left him standing rigid, staring at the exit as though it might open without warning. On Holmes' advice, I approached one of the musicians during the final clearing of the rehearsal, a young woman named Ada Morvan, second-chair violist, whose quiet eyes had caught Holmes' notice during the performance. "I'm told you played with Mr. Venn," I said, striking what I hoped was a friendly tone. She looked up from packing her instrument. "Yes, Dr. Watson. We shared a desk." "He left suddenly, I hear." She nodded. "Yes, very suddenly." "Did he say why?" She hesitated, her fingers pausing mid-knot on the bowstring. "No, just that he wouldn't be coming back. He seemed troubled, distracted." I watched her hands. elegant, capable, but now slightly trembling. Not from cold, I felt sure. You didn't hear anything unusual during the last performance. Her mouth formed a shape as if to speak, then closed. I can't say. But you might wish to. She looked at me with something like fear. People don't like questions here, Dr. Watson. Questions have a way of becoming problems. As she turned to leave, I caught Holmes watching from across the room. He gave me a brief nod. Whatever Ada Morven had not said, Holmes had heard it all the same, in the silence between her words. It was later that same evening, over a modest supper at Baker Street, that Holmes finally broke his silence on a subject which had clearly been fermenting in his mind since the rehearsal. "You may recall, Watson," he said between sips of tea, "that the second violinist, Mr. Gable Hartright, was conspicuously absent this afternoon." I nodded. Penrose mentioned he was unwell. "Unwell, yes," Holmes replied, "but more precisely, unavailable. It seems our Mr. Hartright has been entangled in a most delicate affair, one involving the wife of a certain foreign envoy, recently returned to London under an assumed name. You've uncovered this already?" Holmes gave a faint smile. A note passed discreetly to the first oboist, a housemaid with a fondness for gossip and weak ankles, and the fact that Mrs. Hartright, who does not exist, was listed in the programme as one of the guests of honour during the performance in question. A rather brazen risk for a man in his position. "And you believe this scandal may be connected to the scream?" Holmes leaned back. "Scandals, Watson, are rarely silent. They echo in letters, in glances, in music scores altered to suit the absence of conscience." He tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table. "If jealousy is not the motive, then guilt may be. And if not guilt, then the need to silence someone who knows too much." "And the foreign envoy?" "A man of reputation, but not of restraint. His presence is smoke. We must now find the fire." I had learned over years of association that Holmes often made his grandest discoveries through seemingly trivial things. Scratches on a desk, the angle of a footprint, or in this case, a forgotten programme and a cup of lukewarm tea. It was after dinner when Holmes called me to his writing table. "Observe, Watson," he said, "this programme from the night of the scream. You will note the second movement is annotated with an asterisk." I squinted. "Yes, faint, just above the allegro. Now compare it to this one," he said, laying down another. No asterisk. The same composition, printed only a day earlier. "You suspect forgery?" "I suspect substitution," Holmes replied, "but not for the audience's benefit, for the orchestra's." He placed a third sheet before me, one marked with a dark ink blot in the margin. "This was recovered from Miss Morven's desk. The ink is the same as that on the anonymous note. Same colour, same pressure." "You mean to say—" "I mean that someone altered the orchestral scores before the performance, introduced them quietly, perhaps only 1 or 2 pages, enough to time a distraction, to bury a sound within a swell of strings." He picked up the teacup. "And the culprit, my dear Watson, was not thinking clearly. This rim bears traces of camphor, used to calm the nerves. A nervous hand delivers an imperfect forgery." He smiled. "But an imperfect forgery, once exposed, sings louder than a scream." We returned to Baker Street the following morning, and I found Holmes already deep in comparison between the anonymous musical note once described by Penrose and a series of old European manuscripts scattered across his desk. He looked up only briefly to acknowledge me before continuing his analysis. "Watson," he said at last, tapping a fragment of sheet music with the tip of his pen. "Have you ever heard of Friedrich Lang?" "The Viennese composer," I replied. "Died violently, didn't he? Some political scandal?" Holmes nodded. "Presumed murdered 30 years ago. His last known correspondence was intercepted by the Austrian police. His scores vanished shortly after. Most curious. And you believe the handwriting on Penrose's note matches his?" Not merely matches, Holmes replied. It is identical. The slant, the distinctive loop on the capital S, even the flourish at the end of a line. I've studied 3 authentic letters from the Hofburg archives. There is no doubt. But Lang has been dead for decades. Holmes allowed himself the faintest of smiles. Precisely, which makes his sudden reappearance, via ink and paper, all the more suspicious. I felt a slight chill. You think someone used Lang's hand deliberately? To frighten, to mislead, or to create the illusion of a ghost in the orchestra, Holmes said. Whichever it is, someone believes that resurrection can serve as the perfect disguise. Holmes rarely wasted breath on speculation, but this time I could sense his mind probing deeper into history than usual. He fetched a thin monograph from the shelf, The Lost Masters of Vienna, and flipped to a page marked by the hasty crease of a violin string. Friedrich Lang, he read aloud, composer, pianist, critic, known for his political compositions and scathing editorials, disappeared in 1867 after publishing an exposé accusing several senior diplomats of criminal profiteering during the Hungarian campaign. He snapped the book shut. Lang was not simply a musician. He was a man who made enemies in high places. His death was never officially solved. No body was recovered, and several believed he escaped rather than perished. And yet, I said, you just told me his handwriting appears on a note from last week. Which brings us to 2 possibilities, Holmes said. Either Lang is alive and remarkably preserved, which I doubt, or someone has copied his hand with impressive precision and a clear agenda. But why Lang? Holmes rose and poured himself a measure of coffee. Because to a certain class of musician and intellectual, Lang remains a symbol of defiance, a martyr of sorts. His name carries weight and fear. Invoking him is no mere theatrical gesture, Watson. It is a calculated act of psychological warfare. He sipped the coffee and glanced toward the window, which leads me to suspect the true target was not the audience, nor even the orchestra, but Penrose himself. Later that afternoon, Holmes and I returned to the Philharmonic Hall. Holmes had arranged for Miss Ada Morven to meet him in the corridor behind the string section, a quiet, forgotten place where no rehearsal sounds could reach. I waited at a distance, just beyond the double doors, though the soft murmur of their voices carried enough for me to hear fragments. You play very well, Miss Morven, Holmes began gently. Thank you, she replied, her voice small, and yet I imagine it has been difficult these past few days. A pause. I suppose, Holmes continued, you and Mr. Venn shared a desk. You noticed his change in behaviour, his silences. You heard things the night of the scream, things that others pretended not to. Another pause. Then, softly, tremulously, yes, you are not mad, Miss Morven, Holmes said kindly. You are frightened. There is a difference. She exhaled sharply, as if the breath had been locked in her chest since the performance. I didn't see it. I heard it, she whispered, from behind the curtain. The second swell, just as the allegro began. What did you hear? Her hands twisted in front of her. A shout. A struggle. Something. Someone. Falling. Then silence. A silence that felt wrong. And afterward, she hesitated. A man's voice. Calm. Cold. He said, no one will miss him. Then footsteps. Deliberate retreating. Holmes did not interrupt. She shook her head slowly. I wanted to speak. I almost spoke. But then, the next morning, Venn was gone, and someone had scratched the word Vienna into his locker door. Did you tell anyone? She looked at Holmes with wide, fearful eyes. I'm telling you. When Holmes rejoined me, I could see that Miss Morven's words had settled deeply into his calculations. She's telling the truth, I asked. Beyond doubt, he replied. And that, Watson, confirms it. The scream was no hallucination. It was real, and it was silenced not by ignorance, but by fear. But whose voice did she hear afterward? Ah, Holmes mused. That remains the question, but she heard a scuffle, a collapse, and a voice saying, "No one will miss him." That is not the language of impulse. It is the language of premeditation. We walked in silence for several paces. The name etched into the locker, Vienna, could be a threat or a warning or a confession, Holmes added. But in any case, it links our vanishing violist to Lang once more. And Penrose, Holmes gave me a rare, serious look. Penrose was the only one meant to hear. It was a scream concealed in music, but intended for the conductor's ears alone. The question now, Watson, is whether that scream was meant to summon justice or to stifle it. It was the following morning when Holmes returned from a brisk outing with a gleam in his eye and a paper folded neatly in the pocket of his coat. He removed it and placed it upon the breakfast table with the satisfaction of a magician producing the final card in a game of illusion. "The Deutsche Handelsbank of Munich," he said, tapping the page. A wire transfer dated the morning after the performance, directed to one Mr. Richard Lancombe, addressed care of the Royal Philharmonic Treasurer's Office. Lancombe, I repeated. That name was not among the musicians. Indeed it was not, Holmes replied, because Mr. Lancombe does not exist, or rather, he exists only in the imagination of Mr. Ralph Lennox, our esteemed treasurer. I raised my brows. You're certain it's him? Watson, the address matches Lennox's handwriting on the Philharmonic's correspondence. The ink, the slope, the peculiar looping L, identical to what I've seen on the orchestra's financial ledgers. And the purpose of the wire? A round sum, Holmes said. 5,000 marks. No invoice, no recipient signature. Just a code in the margin. Für das Schweigen, for the silence. My stomach turned slightly. Blackmail? Possibly, or a payment for services rendered. Either way, it points to an arrangement outside the bounds of honest bookkeeping. He folded the page again. Mr. Lennox may not play an instrument, but he has composed something all the same. A quiet transaction behind the stage, masked in German discretion, with a false name and a fatal cost. He glanced out the window, where the fog was beginning to lift. And I dare say the next note in this grim little symphony will arrive soon. Holmes's prediction was not long in fulfilment. By noon, a telegram arrived addressed to Mr. Edgar Penrose, but delivered instead to Baker Street by special arrangement. Penrose having wisely requested Holmes intercept anything unusual. Holmes read it silently, then passed it to me, without comment. It contained a single line, Adagio for the soul that won't be missed. Rehearsal begins again at dusk. There was no signature, but I recognized the same stylized hand Penrose had described from the first note. Long, looping letters, faintly European, and lacking the tremor of uncertainty. Well, I said, it seems whoever wrote this has not finished composing. Holmes gave a dry chuckle. On the contrary, I believe the final bars are about to begin. The use of adagio implies a slow movement, perhaps regret, perhaps finality. And the rehearsal? Holmes stood and reached for his coat. There's no concert scheduled for today, he said, but the orchestra will gather, because I intend to summon them. To what end? He smiled. To perform the same piece. Same players, same setting, same shadows. We shall let the curtain rise again. Only this time, Watson, the audience will be watching from behind. And Penrose. He will conduct, but this time he shall not be the only one listening. The rest of that day passed in a flurry of telegrams, inquiries and quiet arrangements, Holmes working with the silent intensity of a man who already knew the ending, but wished to confirm the final note before striking the chord. It was well after dusk when he paused to speak again. He held in one hand the forged score from Morven's desk, and in the other the copy of the payment record to the alias Lancombe. 3 things, Watson, he said. A score that hides a scream, a payment made for silence, and a composer's name used as a ghost. Each, alone, is odd. Together, they are a confession. To what? I asked. Holmes tapped the edge of the score. To vengeance. Not artistry, not madness, not money. Vengeance, wrapped in musical metaphor. Whoever murdered Venn did not merely wish to remove him, they wished to leave behind a performance, one that only the guilty would applaud. I followed his gaze to the firelight flickering across the violin case near the mantel. The scream was real, the forgery was intentional, the payment was to ensure no one interfered, and the note about the soul that won't be missed. Holmes nodded. That, Watson, was not cruelty, it was certainty. The victim was chosen because he had already been forgotten by those who should have protected him. That is the coldest vengeance of all. He rose and opened the violin case. Tomorrow we return to the Philharmonic, but this time it is not applause I intend to provoke. It was a curious gathering that assembled within the Royal Philharmonic Hall the following evening. The audience was sparse, by design, and the lights deliberately dimmed in the wings. No public notices had been issued, and yet every member of the orchestra who had performed the night of the scream was present. Holmes had ensured this through a series of cryptic telegrams and persuasive missives dispatched through Penrose. The concert, as Holmes termed it, would be conducted in private, with no programme issued and no intermission planned. I was struck by the gravity of the occasion. Musicians unpacked their instruments with an air more suited to a funeral than a rehearsal. Holmes had left nothing to chance. Lestrade arrived shortly before 7 o'clock, dressed plainly and introduced as an investor with an interest in acoustics. He took his place in the back row and said not a word. Holmes himself did not appear until just before the downbeat. He emerged from the corridor, composed and pale, and moved to Penrose, who stood by the conductor's platform, uncertain. "Whatever happens," Holmes whispered, "do not stop the music. Let it rise. Let it break." Penrose nodded, if with some reluctance, and turned to face his orchestra. I took my assigned place beside the second wing, close enough to hear the faint shifting of shoes behind the curtain. Holmes stood just behind the second violinists, his eyes fixed not on the players, but on the shadows behind them. The baton lifted, the music began, and thus commenced a performance unlike any I had ever attended, not for its sound, but for what it sought to unearth beneath the silence. There was an uncanny stillness to the opening movement. Holmes had insisted on the exact same piece that had been played the night of the scream, and the same arrangement, with no substitutions. Even the positioning of chairs and stands had been reconstructed according to Penrose's memory and Holmes' notations. The musicians played with unusual restraint, as if conscious of the invisible weight bearing down upon them. Their eyes glanced often not at Penrose, but to the curtain-lined wings, as though the ghost of the scream still lingered there, waiting to resurface. Mr. Hartwright, the second violinist, sat rigid as stone. His bow hand moved with mechanical precision, yet his gaze betrayed an inward trembling. Miss Morven, seated to his right, kept her eyes on the strings, never once looking up. At one point, Holmes moved slightly to his left, aligning himself with the column that obscured part of the backstage corridor. I noticed he had his stopwatch in hand, though I could not imagine what measure he was timing. Penrose gave no outward sign of distress. Yet I saw his jaw clench as the orchestra approached the passage he had once described. The moment of crescendo where the scream had been buried. The music surged, my breath caught. Holmes did not move, and then, quite suddenly, a strange thing occurred. The second oboe missed its cue by half a beat, as if distracted by something only it had noticed. The violinists faltered for the briefest of moments, an imperceptible ripple to most ears. But one Holmes surely clocked. He leaned closer to the wing. Something had shifted, not in the music, but in the air behind it. And Holmes, I knew, had heard it. Holmes had positioned me precisely where the shadow of the curtain fell upon the stage's edge, a narrow vantage point where I could observe the space behind the orchestra without being seen. I had protested the assignment. I am no spy. But Holmes had insisted. "Your presence, Watson," he'd said, "offers a calm that may rattle the less certain nerves behind the scenes. Observe, but do not interfere, unless I signal." From my place, I saw little of the music itself, but much of the tension behind it. There were movements in the corridor, a flash of cloth, a head darting back behind a case, the flicker of a hand pulling back a velvet flap, all too subtle to be theatre staff. Meanwhile, Lestrade waited in the shadows of the gallery, as agreed, armed, alert, and silent. A man of blunt instinct, perhaps, but reliable when danger stepped from speculation into fact. As the orchestra pressed into its second movement, the hush grew heavier. Holmes stood now unmoving, his gaze fixed on the corridor beside the treasurer's office. I followed it and thought I saw a door slowly closing, though no hand was visible on the latch. And then, beneath the rising of the strings, I thought I heard it. Not a scream, but a single click, followed by the faintest shuffling movement beneath the risers. I turned toward Holmes. He did not meet my eye, but tapped his watch once, then folded it shut. A signal. Something, someone was in motion, and the second half of the performance had begun in earnest. At the end of the allegro, Holmes stepped forward onto the conductor's platform with the cool grace of a man announcing a toast. Penrose froze mid-motion, and the musicians lowered their bows. Holmes turned to face them, not with accusation, but with a gloved hand holding a slip of paper. "My apologies for the interruption," he said, his voice calm but carrying. "I have just received a message. It reads, 'The second violin shall be silent tonight, but someone else may scream.'" A murmur rippled through the players. Hartwright's face paled visibly. Morven bowed her head. Holmes tucked the note into his coat. "A curious thing," he continued. "It was delivered anonymously to the Philharmonic box office less than an hour ago. Slipped beneath the door. No signature. Just silence, an implication. No one spoke." The second violinist's hand trembled. Holmes turned to Penrose. "If you would be so kind, resume the movement precisely where it broke. There is something unfinished, and I should very much like to hear how it concludes." Penrose, though visibly shaken, gave a slow nod. He raised the baton once more. The musicians obeyed, though with tension now thick enough to feel between the notes. The harmony returned, but with the haunted echo of words that had not been sung. I could not help but feel we were no longer in a concert hall, but a courtroom, and Holmes, as ever, had transformed art into cross-examination. And though no one screamed aloud, I felt certain that someone, somewhere behind the curtain, was listening in terror, waiting for the moment when Holmes would strike the final note. The orchestra resumed once more, this time with Holmes absent from the stage, having vanished into the shadows near the left wing. I kept my gaze fixed on the far corridor where he had last stood, though a tension had now spread like frost across the hall. The musicians, though steady, now played with the cautious precision of soldiers marching through mined ground. And then, in the silence between two bars, a silence so brief it barely separated sound from sound, I heard it, a soft click, then a groan, as though something strained against iron hinges. It came from beneath the platform. The audience, what few guests had been allowed, heard nothing. The musicians, absorbed in the act of performance, carried on, but I, watching from the wings, saw it happen. The floor panel just behind the curtain buckled and folded open on a hidden hinge, revealing a narrow shaft descending into darkness. Holmes emerged from behind a pillar, expression sharp and movements deliberate. He raised a hand, not to stop the music, but to signal Lestrade, who had risen from his chair like a dog catching scent. I followed, heart quickening. Holmes stepped to the trapdoor, leaned in, and pulled a lantern from within his coat. The light flickered across a hidden staircase, rough-hewn and narrow, descending into what had clearly been a long-forgotten understage storage vault. "I suspected as much," he murmured. "An architect's indulgence. Sealed since the hall's expansion. Only a stagehand or financial officer would remember it." Lestrade descended first, revolver drawn. Holmes and I followed. The stair creaked but held. The air grew damp. And then, below, at the edge of the light, we saw the unmistakable glint of a brass instrument case, and beside it, something worse. "Dear God," I whispered. Holmes said nothing, for the scream that had once gone unheard had been buried here, beneath wood and velvet, beneath music and lies. It was Harold Venn. There could be no doubt. The face, though greyed with time and airless dark, bore the same high cheekbones and parted hair I recalled from his photograph in the Philharmonic's printed programmes. His body had been twisted behind a crate of unused risers, half covered by a moth-eaten drape and the dust of many undisturbed months. Holmes examined him briefly, fingers gentle but impersonal. No marks to the throat, no bruising to the skull, no blood. Lestrade, peering over Holmes' shoulder, grimaced. "Poison?" Holmes nodded. "Likely chloral or digitalis. Something quick, something silent." He moved to the corner of the chamber where an overturned stool and shattered flask suggested the means. Forced upon him, no doubt, the scene was not one of struggle, but suppression. I bent to retrieve a folded page, stuck between the slats of a cello case nearby. Holmes took it and unfolded it carefully. It was a score, but this was no performance sheet. It bore only a single repeated phrase, scrawled in increasingly jagged hand. "He knew, he knew, he knew." Lestrade glanced toward the trapdoor. "And who exactly knew what?" Holmes folded the paper slowly. "That, Inspector, is the final measure. But I would wager Mr. Lennox has composed more than music behind his desk." We climbed back into the light of the wings. Above us, the orchestra reached its final cadence. But below, the silence that followed had spoken at last. It was not long before the final curtain fell. Not on the concert, but on the culprit. Ralph Lennox was found attempting to leave the hall through a seldom-used rear exit. His coat hastily buttoned and his hands stained faintly with oil. Oil that matched the hinges of the trapdoor Holmes had opened not 20 minutes before. Holmes stopped him at the threshold with the air of a man confirming an answer to his own riddle. "You played the part well, Mr. Lennox," Holmes said, "but you made one fatal miscalculation." Lennox froze. "I don't know what you mean." "On the contrary," said Holmes, "you knew exactly what Venn had uncovered. Your shell transfers, your fictitious invoices, the musical grants that vanished into accounts in Munich. He confronted you, didn't he? The night of the concert." Lennox said nothing. "And you silenced him, not with violence, but with chemistry and concealment. A trapdoor, long forgotten, restored for your needs. And then the music played, and you stood at the rear of the hall while the scream echoed unheard." Still, Lennox said nothing. But the tremble in his jaw betrayed the truth already known. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, I believe you'll find a second ledger in the Treasurer's office. One with entries in German, signed under the name Lancombe." Lestrade stepped forward. "That'll do, Mr. Lennox." As the man was taken away, Penrose emerged from the shadows, pale and shaken. "I heard it," he murmured. "That night, I wasn't mad." "No," Holmes said gently. "You were simply the only man who listened while the rest applauded." And with that, the mystery played its final note, not loud, but true. We returned to Baker Street late that evening, with the case resolved in the eyes of Scotland Yard, but not, as I was swiftly reminded, in the restless theatre of Holmes's mind. The fire had been stoked, the curtains drawn, and yet the room felt oddly still. Holmes's violin, which often hung at his side like a contemplative companion, rested untouched upon its stand. He removed his coat with absent precision and fell into the armchair opposite mine. I, for my part, poured a measure of brandy and handed it to him, though I might as well have given it to the hat stand for all the attention he paid. "Well," I ventured, "the facts are clear enough, surely. Lennox's guilt is indisputable." Holmes raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "You doubt it?" I asked, puzzled. "No, my dear Watson, I do not doubt the guilt," he said slowly. "What I doubt is the simplicity. Lennox was a careful man, but not inspired. The death of Venn was calculated, yes, but the notes, the forged signature, the cryptic metaphors, that smacks of theatricality, of an audience far beyond our concert hall." He stood, stepped to the window, and drew back the curtain. "It is not enough, Watson, to catch a murderer. One must also understand why he chose that moment, that place, and that manner. Otherwise, we have merely swapped shadows." Outside, the street lamps flickered faintly in the London fog. "Come," Holmes said, turning abruptly. "Let us take the case apart once more. But this time, let us listen not to the music, but to the silence beneath it. Consider," Holmes began, as he sorted through a stack of musical scores and telegrams, "the peculiar timing of that single dreadful cry. Penrose claimed it rang out precisely as the crescendo rose, just before the percussive clash that crowned the first movement." "Yes," I nodded, "but only he heard it." "Exactly, because only he was listening for it." I blinked. "I don't follow." Holmes tapped the conductor's annotated score. "The scream was real, Watson, but it was not accidental. It was placed, like a trumpet note or a cymbal crash. It occurred at a moment when the full force of the orchestra would mask any irregularity, and it was precisely that moment which allowed the killer to act." "You mean—" "I mean," Holmes said, "that Lennox chose that instant not merely for convenience, but because it gave him cover. He had rehearsed it. Not with the orchestra, of course, but with fate. A man screams, dies, and not a soul notices, save the one who knows to listen." He lifted the score and pointed to a particular notation, a penciled circle at the top of a page. "This," he said, "was Venn's own mark. He anticipated something, perhaps even suspected Lennox, but he never made it to the final bar." I was silent for a moment. "But how did Lennox know he could hide it there?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Because he trusted human nature. A hall full of music lovers does not expect horror. It expects harmony. And so long as the music played, no one heard the scream of a dying man." He paused. "Except Penrose, the only man who ever conducted truth instead of applause." I handed Holmes the two anonymous notes which had haunted the investigation from the first, the initial verse about dissonance and silence, and the later warning of another scream before the final chord. Holmes examined them now with something between contempt and admiration. "They are, in their way, brilliant," he said. "A killer's riddles disguised as a musician's melancholy." "They were from Lennox?" "No," Holmes said firmly. "Not in his hand, nor in his nature. Lennox was an embezzler and a coward, but a poet of murder? No, these came from another." I leaned forward. "Another conspirator? Not precisely. More what's the word? A curator of events. Someone who wished the crime to be seen, eventually, as art." I stared. "But why?" "Because such a person believes that truth, when hidden behind metaphor, gains power. The verses were never intended to help us. They were meant to frame the crime, to create a narrative in which the killer was not simply caught, but revealed with operatic flair." I considered the implications. "So they weren't warnings, they were staging notes." Holmes nodded, and riddled with red herrings, the musical metaphors, the veiled threats. They pushed us to see the murder as part of something grand, almost mythic, when in truth it was financial, cold, efficient. He tossed the notes onto the hearth, where they curled slightly in the warmth. In the end, he murmured, even a scream can be tuned to a key. I looked toward the window, the fog beyond, now thicker than before. And what of the person who wrote them? I asked. Holmes folded his hands. That, Watson, is a different case. But I dare say their encore is not yet written. As Holmes pulled from his file the final document, a letter from the German consulate, sealed and smudged by hurried hands, I noted again the strange false name that had shadowed our case from the outset. Lang, I said aloud. Holmes nodded. Yes, Lang, or rather, Karl Langendorf, a composer presumed dead in 1889. But his signature appeared not once, but twice in this affair. Once on the forged letter to Penrose, and once in the archives of the Leipzig bank that processed the anonymous transfer to our villain's account. He paused. Lang was no ghost, Watson, but he was no composer either. I frowned. Then who? Holmes held up the consulate letter. A minor attaché, seconded to the embassy for 2 years. A man with a fondness for theatre and mischief, now retired in Vienna. His real name? Friedrich Elsner. The letters were his, penned years ago in jest for a failed operetta that never saw the stage. But how did they come into Lennox's hands? Holmes sat back. Through the office of one Ambassador von Kessler, whose habit of gifting old manuscripts as diplomatic tokens eventually reached our Philharmonic's benefactors. Lennox, curious and unscrupulous, recognized an opportunity. A signature feared and admired, a name cloaked in legend. He resurrected Lang as a spectre to haunt his victim, and thereby deflect suspicion. I exhaled slowly. So the ghost of a composer was merely an echo of a bureaucrat's whimsy. Holmes rose and took the fire tongs, gently feeding the last of the forged pages into the flame. And yet, I said, it worked. The forgery delayed our reasoning. The myth distracted the eye. Holmes smiled faintly. Theatricality, Watson. It clouds the mind more effectively than darkness. But even the finest illusion collapses under scrutiny. He turned to the mantel and adjusted the clock by a single minute. Let Lang rest in fiction, where he belongs. Our concern is not with shadows of art, but with the hands that wielded them. It was not until the following morning, as the fog receded from the rooftops and London resumed its slow stir, that Holmes drew my attention to the last, and perhaps most damning, piece of the puzzle. He did so in his most infuriatingly casual manner, a gesture toward a folded velvet drapery laid upon the breakfast table, as though it were a discarded shawl. You see it, Watson? I leaned in. It's part of the stage curtain, surely. Just so, removed under the indulgent gaze of Lestrade, who was too satisfied with Lennox's confession to object to a little theatrical forensics. I examined the fabric more closely, running my fingers along the hem. There, near one edge, was a jagged little tear, no larger than a coin, and within it, barely perceptible, the faded smear of something dark. Blood? I asked. Precisely. And more than that, placement, Watson. That curtain framed the left wing of the stage. Lennox would have passed through it only once, when returning from what was ostensibly a trip to the lavatory, but was in truth a rendezvous with murder. But he must have brushed it by accident. Accidents, my dear fellow, leave no patterns. This tear, this smear, it lies at precisely elbow height. And more, the blood matches that of Venn. It is old, dried, but still there. A signature of haste, of a man who thrust open the curtain with a guilty arm. I sat back, slightly stunned. But why didn't anyone see it? Because it was red upon red. Velvet conceals blood better than any alibi ever could. Holmes folded the fabric with care and placed it back upon the table. It was not a grand clue, he said, but it confirmed everything. The moment, the direction, the haste, and most of all, the stain guilt cannot help but leave behind. That afternoon, we sat in companionable quiet. Holmes had at last taken up his violin and was drawing from it a slow, plaintive melody, not one of the masterworks, but something private, improvisational, and tinged with melancholy. I had long suspected that Holmes reserved his truest sentiments for the strings alone, and on this occasion I did not interrupt. When he paused at last, laying the bow aside, I said, "You never truly cared about the Philharmonic, did you?" Holmes gave a dry smile. "As an institution, no, but as a stage upon which truth might stumble, very much so." I nodded. And yet the scream, one sound in a sea of others, it made all the difference. "Watson," Holmes said, "do you know why Penrose heard the scream?" "Because he was listening for it." "No," Holmes said, folding his long fingers beneath his chin. "Because he understood music. He knew how silence moves. He knew when a sound does not belong. And so when Venn cried out, even for a split second, Penrose felt the rupture, even if he could not name it. He stood and walked to the fire, eyes distant. There is something fascinating about crimes hidden in harmony. We expect violence to clash, to disrupt, but some of the darkest deeds slip past precisely because they blend in. A scream timed perfectly, a body placed within the expected pauses. A letter disguised as art. He turned to me. "Even the loudest music cannot drown a guilty heart, Watson. It only forces the rest of us to listen more closely." I felt the weight of that sentence settle between us. "Do you think Lennox would have gotten away with it had Penrose not spoken?" Holmes considered. "Perhaps, but guilt festers, even in silence, especially in silence. Lennox would have played his final movement eventually, one way or another." We did not speak again for some time. The violin sat idle. Outside, the faint tap of rain began against the window pane, and in that quiet, I thought again of the scream only one man truly heard, and of the detective who made the world stop just long enough to listen. There is a curious stillness that settles over Baker Street once a case has run its course, not unlike the hush that falls after the final note of a concert. The fog had returned that evening, curling about the window panes like a lingering thought, and Holmes sat in his armchair with an unread newspaper drooping from one hand. I had taken to my journal, though the pen hesitated over the page. How does one articulate a mystery that had begun with silence and ended with a symphony of concealed truths? The events at the Philharmonic had stirred something deeper than intellectual curiosity. They had tapped into the unnerving knowledge that even the most brutal of acts may pass unnoticed if they wear the right disguise. Violence had crept beneath the hem of music, hidden itself behind chords and curtain folds. That the world had not heard it was not its failing, but its design. Only Holmes, ever attuned to disruptions in the ordinary, had heard the crime's hidden cadence. Outside, a cab rattled distantly over the cobbles. Inside, the gas lamps glowed soft and yellow. The performance was over, but the echoes remained, refusing to fade just yet. Holmes rose without a word, drew his violin from its worn case, and began to play. It was not one of the grand concertos or brisk, methodical exercises he so often favoured, but something softer, slower, steeped in melancholy. The adagio from the second note, I realised, though stripped of its orchestral grandeur, alone in Holmes' hands, it was transformed into something private, a requiem, perhaps, not just for the dead, but for illusions undone. The melody floated through the room, curling into corners, brushing against the fire's quiet hiss. He played not for me, nor for any imagined audience, but I suspect for the dead man who had screamed and been swallowed by sound. There was reverence in the gesture, and regret too, though Holmes would never confess it aloud. When he stopped, the silence that followed was more eloquent than the music itself. Holmes rested his violin upon his knee, the bow still poised in his fingers. He stared not at me, but at the fire, whose flickers painted his face in restless gold. "A scream may be silent, Watson," he said at last, "but only to those who refuse to hear it." I blinked, unsure whether he addressed me or the flames. "And fortunately for London," I replied, "you hear what the rest of us cannot." He did not smile, not quite, but a small flicker passed across his mouth, approval perhaps, or amusement, and then he returned the instrument to its case with the same delicacy one reserves for a fragile truth. There was something final in the motion, like the last page of a score turned at last. And yet I knew, as did he, that Baker Street would not remain quiet for long. A silence such as this, in Holmes' company, was merely an intermission. I closed my journal with a quiet snap, content that the final sentences had done some justice to the strangeness of the affair. Holmes had resumed his seat, this time with the paper folded precisely, the violin tucked away. The lamps flickered gently, and for a moment the world seemed still. Then came a sound, faint, deliberate, unmistakable. A knock at the door. I looked to Holmes, who did not stir. His eyes, half-lidded, betrayed nothing, but the corner of his mouth tugged upward, the barest ghost of a smile. "You're not going to answer it?" I asked. "I imagine, Watson, that it will wait precisely long enough for you to satisfy your curiosity." I rose, heart already quickening. The last case had barely drawn breath, and already a new one stirred beyond the threshold. As I reached for the doorknob, I glanced back once more. Holmes had resumed his thoughtful pose, fingers steepled beneath his chin. It struck me then how little he needed the world to entertain him, for it always arrived, unbidden and unsolved, at his very doorstep. And I, ever his chronicler, stepped forward once more, pen in hand, mystery at the ready. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the last note of the mournful melody still hanging in the air like a ghost, unwilling to depart. His fingers rested lightly on the violin's neck, but his gaze had drifted to the fire. "A curious thing, Watson," he said quietly, "how the most deafening screams are often the ones no one hears. It was not the boldness of the act that concealed it, but its perfect timing. Violence nestled inside beauty, and not one among them thought to look." I nodded, still shaken by how close the orchestra had come to becoming an accomplice by sheer ignorance. "And the letters?" I asked. "Ah," Holmes mused, "a symphony of deceit. But like all poorly composed music, there were notes out of place, too sharp, too soon. All one had to do was listen. What do you think was the villain's most fatal mistake? Trusting the music to mask his crime, or believing Holmes wouldn't hear the discord? I'd love to know your thoughts. Leave a comment with your answer below. And if you enjoyed unraveling this mystery with us, don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes cases and share the story with a friend who loves a clever puzzle. The game, as ever, is far from over.